I worked for my family for years, then one folder proved I was never meant to belong. I graduated thinking I had finally earned my place in our family shop. I thought the years would count. The long nights. The weekends. The "just help one more time" promises. I was wrong. My name is Calvin Hartman. Our workshop sits on the edge of a busy Texas city, between warehouses and a loud road that smells like hot asphalt after rain. From the outside, people see a proud family business. Inside, there were rules no one said out loud. My father, Eugene, loved to talk about legacy. He would say it while he ran his hand over a finished countertop like it was a trophy. My mother, Marla, cared about image. She cared about what people saw, what they believed, and how our name looked in photos. And then there was my younger brother, Waldo. Waldo never smelled like sawdust. He showed up with clean shoes and a bright smile. When clients came in, he stepped into the showroom like he belonged there. He talked fast. He laughed at the right time. My father and mother watched him like he was proof they had built something important. When they looked at me, it was different. I was already the worker. Already placed. I learned that early. As a teen, my weekends were not fun. They were sanding, lifting, packing, fixing mistakes no one wanted to claim. My hands cracked every winter. The skin never fully healed. My father called it building character. My mother called it being helpful. I called it what it felt like. Survival. Still, I stayed close. I wanted to be chosen. I wanted them to say my name with pride, not just with instructions. By the time I finished college, I truly believed things would change. I came back with new skills. I knew how to plan schedules. I knew how to track costs. I knew how to keep projects from falling apart when pressure hit. I imagined sitting at the table during decisions, not standing in the corner waiting for orders. But nothing changed. I worked harder. I worked smarter. I worked longer. 60-hour weeks became normal. Some nights, I drove home so tired my hands shook when I tried to unlock my door. Payment was always coming. If I asked, my mother would sigh like I was being rude. If I pushed, my father would say cash flow was tight. They always ended with the same line. It's for the business. It will come back to you. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. What hurt was not the work. It was the silence around it. When a project went well, my parents praised Waldo. When something went wrong, it landed on my bench. When a client had a problem, I handled it. When a deadline looked impossible, I made it possible. Waldo stayed clean. I stayed useful. Sometimes my mother would watch me load heavy materials into my truck. She would speak in a soft voice, like she was being kind. "You're lucky," she said once. "You're good with your hands. Not everyone has that." She meant it like comfort. I heard it like a limit. It was like she was saying, "This is all you are for." Even then, I stayed. Because when you grow up being useful instead of chosen, you learn to mix up endurance with love. You start to think pain is proof you belong. Then small things began to shift. Not big fights. Not loud scenes. Just little moments that felt wrong. Meetings happened without me. People stopped asking my opinion. Supplier choices were made already. Client calls I used to handle went unanswered until Waldo jumped in with a smooth email that sounded confident but said almost nothing. Meanwhile, my workload grew heavier. I was the one fixing rushed orders. I was the one staying late to correct errors. I was the one smoothing problems before they became disasters. I didn't even complain. I just kept moving, because that was my role. One day, I suggested a change to stop a delay that kept repeating. I laid it out clearly. Step by step. It was simple. It would save time and money. My father nodded. "We'll think about it," he said. 2 months later, Waldo presented the same idea like it was new. He framed it like a vision. My parents smiled like they had never heard it before. They praised him in front of everyone. The room clapped. Waldo acted humble. I stood there with sawdust on my sleeves and felt something tighten inside me. Not anger yet. Just a cold understanding. This was not about effort. This was about a story they had already written. In that story, Waldo was the future. And I was the tool. The real turning point came on a quiet evening. Most of the crew had left early after a delivery. I stayed behind to grab paperwork my father said he needed. Insurance stuff, he called it. I knew where the files were. I opened the drawer. Folders slid and bumped with a soft thud. One folder had a clean label on it, internal planning. I told myself not to look. My hand moved anyway. I sat down and opened it. At first, the words did not feel real. Then they sharpened into something that made my stomach drop. There were plans. Timelines. Notes. Names. Waldo's name was everywhere. Mine showed up once. Just once. Under a line that said, transition phase out. I read it again, slower, hoping I misunderstood. I hadn't. They did not forget me. They had planned for me. Quietly. Carefully. Months ago. I closed the folder. I placed it back exactly where it was. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow. Like the air had been pulled out of me. That night, I went home and lay awake staring at the ceiling. I replayed every promise. Every later. Every we need you. Every time I told myself to be patient. And in the dark, I finally said the truth out loud, even if only to myself. They weren't building a future with me. They were building one on me. And now I knew. The next morning, I went back to the workshop like nothing had happened. Same boots. Same worn jacket. Same apron that still smelled like oil and wood dust. I nodded to the crew. I turned on my station. I worked. But something inside me was gone. Before, I worked with hope. With the quiet belief that if I proved myself long enough, someone would finally notice. That belief died the moment I saw my name listed as an exit plan. So I stopped giving more than I was asked for. Not dramatically. Not angrily. I simply stopped absorbing damage. When the day ended, I cleaned my station and left. No staying late, just to help. No fixing mistakes that weren't assigned to me. No solving problems quietly so others could look competent. At first, no one noticed. The system had been built around my silence for years. It took time before the cracks showed. A supplier called asking for clarification on measurements I usually handled. I forwarded the call to the office. A client emailed with technical questions. I replied politely and looped in management instead of answering directly. When a delivery came in late, I documented it and moved on instead of reworking the entire schedule to hide the delay. Nothing broke immediately. But nothing flowed smoothly either. Meetings got longer. Decisions stalled. Confusion crept in where certainty used to be. I watched from a distance, hands folded, doing only what was asked. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the guilt. I saw the crew struggling with issues I could solve in minutes. These were people who had worked beside me for years. People who trusted me. Walking past a problem without fixing it felt wrong in my bones. But I reminded myself of something important. If I kept fixing everything, nothing would ever change. I wasn't sabotaging the business. I was letting it run exactly as it was designed to run without me carrying the weight in secret. Outside the workshop, strange things started to happen. A supplier I had worked with for years pulled me aside during a routine pickup. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. "You sticking around long term?" he asked. I hesitated. He nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. "Whatever you do," he said, "you'll be fine." A few days later, a longtime client sent me a message thanking me for a recent project. At the end of the email, almost casually, they asked if I had ever considered working independently. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But I saved the message. The real collapse came at the end of that week. I was loading my truck when my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. He rarely called me directly during work hours. His voice was tight when I answered. "We have a situation," he said. I leaned against the truck bed and waited. "Our biggest client has concerns," he continued. "They're asking questions. Ones only you can answer." I looked back at the workshop. The open bay doors. The hum of machines. The place that had taken years from me while planning my exit behind my back. "I'll get back to you," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. I didn't return the call right away. I sat in the truck with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. For years, that place had felt like home. Now it felt like a room I had already left. When I finally called him back, my voice was calm. "What are their concerns?" I asked. My father exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. "They want changes. Technical ones. They're not comfortable moving forward without reassurance." "Everything's documented," I said. "It's all in the shared system." There was a pause. "They asked for you," he said quietly. That was the first real crack. That evening was our usual family dinner. Same house. Same polished table. Same chairs that had held us through years of unspoken rules. Normally, I arrived early to help. That night, I arrived on time. My mother was arranging dishes. She glanced up, smiled briefly, then went back to fixing a napkin that didn't need fixing. Waldo arrived next, confident, phone already in his hand. My father followed, carrying a bottle of wine like nothing was wrong. We sat. Small talk filled the space. Waldo mentioned a post that had done well online. My mother nodded approvingly. My father commented on the weather. It felt rehearsed. Like a scene practiced without me. I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder in the center of the table. No one touched it. "What's that?" my father asked. "You already know," I said. My mother's hand froze mid-motion. Waldo's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to his phone. I opened it and slid it toward them. "I found this," I said. "By accident. But it explains a lot." My father leaned forward and read. His jaw tightened. My mother didn't look at the paper. She looked at me. "That was internal planning," she said calmly. "You weren't meant to see it yet." "Yet," I repeated. "So there was a time you planned to tell me I was being phased out?" Waldo finally spoke, his tone light, almost bored. "You're overreacting. It's just structure." "Structure," I said, turning to him, "that gives you everything and gives me nothing." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. My mother sighed, the sound heavy with practiced disappointment. "You've always been good with your hands," she said. "That's your strength. But leadership requires a different kind of mind." There it was. The sentence I had heard in pieces my entire life, finally said without softening. "Good with your hands. Not your brain." Something loosened in my chest. Not pain. Relief. "So all those years," I said slowly, "the unpaid weeks, the problems I solved, the clients I saved, none of that mattered?" "It mattered," my father said quickly. "Of course it did. But not enough to count," I replied. Silence filled the room. Then my father's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and stood up, stepping away to answer. His voice dropped. His shoulders tensed. When he came back, the bottle of wine was still untouched in his hand. "It's the client," he said. "They're pulling back." Waldo scoffed. "They're bluffing." "They're not," my father snapped, then caught himself. He turned to me. "They said if you're not involved, they're reconsidering everything." I met his eyes. "I told you," I said, "everything you need is documented." "They don't want documents," he said. "They want the person they trust." My mother looked between us, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "the relationship was with me. Not the image. Not the name. Me." Another buzz. My father checked his phone again. His hand shook. "They're done," he said quietly. Effective immediately. The room felt smaller. Waldo stood up, his confidence cracking for the first time. "That's impossible." "They sent notice," my father replied. My mother stared at the table. My father looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, and far too late. "You could stop this," he said. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Not anymore." Silence stretched across the table, thick and uncomfortable. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have meant I still wanted something from them. What I felt instead was distance, clear, steady, irreversible. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said finally. "I'm doing this because I finally understand my role here. And it's not one I'm willing to keep playing." My mother's voice wavered. "We are your family." "I know," I said. "That's why this hurts. But family doesn't quietly plan your exit while benefiting from your work." Waldo crossed his arms. "So what, you're just walking away?" "I already did," I replied. I gathered the folder, slid it back into my bag, and stood. My father reached out, then stopped himself, his hand hovering in the air like he wasn't sure he had the right anymore. "This didn't have to happen," he said. "You're right," I answered. "It didn't. But you chose it." I walked out without another word. The night air felt cooler than I expected. I sat in my truck for a moment, breathing, letting years of tension drain from my shoulders. My phone buzzed, one final message from the client, brief and professional, thanking me for my work and confirming they were moving on. I didn't reply. For the first time in years, the future felt open. Not because I had won something, but because I had stopped waiting to be chosen. The fallout didn't explode. It unraveled. Within days, the workshop felt different. Calls went unanswered. Meetings dragged on without decisions. Suppliers started asking for confirmations that used to be automatic. A few long-standing clients quietly paused their projects, citing internal reassessments. No shouting. No drama. Just distance. And I learned that distance can do more damage than conflict ever could. I continued showing up for a short time, not out of loyalty, but integrity. I finished what I had already committed to, documented everything carefully, left nothing incomplete. Then, one Friday afternoon, I cleaned my station for the last time. I didn't make a speech. I didn't announce my departure. I simply left. A week later, I met someone new, not as a daughter, not as labor, but as a professional. She didn't care about my last name or my place in someone else's story. She cared about results, clarity, and trust. The offer was simple. Fair pay. Defined authority. Mutual respect. For the first time, my calendar felt like it belonged to me. At home, my phone rang less. When it did, I let it go to voicemail. My parents left messages that circled accountability without touching it. Waldo posted more than ever, louder captions, thinner confidence. I didn't engage. The strangest part was the quiet. No late-night calls. No emergencies landing on my shoulders. No invisible weight pressing against my chest. I slept through the night. I cooked dinner without checking my phone. My hands still bore the marks of years of work, but they no longer shook from exhaustion. They rested. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I chose. And in that choice, something finally balanced. For a long time, I believed my value came from being needed by people who never planned to choose me. I was wrong. Your worth isn't decided by who takes credit for your work or who sidelines you when it's convenient. It's built in what you know, what you give, and what you finally stop giving away for free. There was one last conversation, weeks later. My father called. I answered, not out of obligation, but closure. We didn't realize how much you were carrying, he said. I know, I replied. That's the problem. He didn't argue. Neither did I. When the call ended, I set my phone down and didn't feel the urge to pick it back up. Outside, the world kept moving. And for the first time, I was moving with it, on my own terms. The weeks that followed didn't bring fireworks or dramatic apologies. They brought something quieter, and in many ways, harder to process, consistency. No more calls asking for, just a little help. No more messages framed as concern but loaded with expectation. No more emergencies that somehow only I was qualified to fix. At first, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. My body still tensed when my phone buzzed. I still caught myself thinking, I should check in, before remembering there was nothing left to manage. Work settled into a new rhythm. The projects I handled now came with clear scopes and clear credit. When something went well, my name was attached to it without hesitation. When something needed improvement, it was discussed openly, without blame disguised as guidance. I wasn't being tested or measured against someone else's image. I was simply trusted. That trust changed me more than I expected. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I spoke up sooner. I didn't apologize for taking up space. The version of me that used to brace herself before every conversation slowly loosened its grip. One afternoon, while organizing files at my new desk, I realized something almost embarrassing. I felt proud. Not relieved. Not vindicated. Proud. The kind of pride that doesn't need witnesses. Outside of work, my world shifted too. I started reconnecting with people I'd unintentionally pushed aside while trying to hold my family together. Old friends who had learned not to ask how I was because the answer was always complicated. We met for coffee, for walks, for quiet dinners where no one needed anything from me except my presence. I learned how to rest without guilt. Not the shallow kind of rest where you're technically still but mentally running through obligations. Real rest. The kind that lets your shoulders drop and your breath slow. Occasionally, information filtered back to me through mutual contacts. The workshop was struggling. Not collapsing, not yet, but strained. Without someone absorbing mistakes before they reached the surface, small issues became visible ones. Timelines slipped. Clients asked harder questions. The image my parents had curated so carefully began to show cracks. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt sadness, for what could have been, and for how unnecessary it all was. Once, my other parent showed up unannounced at my door. I didn't open it right away. Through the peephole, I saw hesitation written across a familiar face. Not anger. Not authority. Uncertainty. When I finally did open the door, we stood there in silence for a long moment. I just wanted to see how you were doing, they said. I'm doing well, I replied. And for the first time, it wasn't a defensive statement. It was simply true. They nodded, eyes drifting to the hallway behind me, as if expecting to see remnants of the old version of me still living there. I didn't realize how much you carried, they said again. I know, I answered gently. But realizing it now doesn't change what happened then. They didn't argue. That was new. We talked for a few minutes, carefully, like people navigating unfamiliar ground. No promises. No negotiations. When they left, I closed the door and felt steady. Not hopeful. Not bitter. Just steady. And that's when I understood the real shift. Walking away hadn't made me smaller. It hadn't made me cruel. It hadn't destroyed my sense of family. It had clarified it. Family, I learned, isn't defined by proximity or obligation. It's defined by reciprocity. By whether your presence is valued beyond what you produce. By whether your absence is felt as loss, not inconvenience. I no longer needed them to understand my decision for it to be valid. I had built something solid out of what was left of myself once I stopped being endlessly useful. A life where my skills were respected, my limits were honored, and my future wasn't quietly planned without me. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. You don't owe your labor to people who've already decided you're expendable. You don't owe your silence to people who benefit from it. And you don't have to stay where your value is measured only by what you give. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't proving them wrong. It's leaving, and letting the truth catch up on its own. I didn't expect healing to arrive quietly. I thought it would come with a conversation, an apology, or at least a moment where someone finally admitted they were wrong. Instead, it came on an ordinary morning, weeks later, when I realized I hadn't thought about the workshop in days. Not with anger. Not with grief. Not even with curiosity. That absence was the real ending. I used to wake up already tired, my mind racing through other people's problems before my feet even touched the floor. Now my morning started slower. Coffee. Light through the window. A few minutes of stillness that belonged only to me. It felt unfamiliar at first, like wearing clothes that didn't need adjusting every 5 seconds. I began to understand how deeply my identity had been tied to being needed. When that need disappeared, it left a hollow space, but also room. Room for choices that weren't reactive. Room for interests I'd shelved because they didn't serve anyone else. Room for rest that wasn't earned through exhaustion. One evening, while sorting through old boxes, I found a pair of work gloves from my early days at the shop. The leather was cracked, the stitching worn thin. I remembered how proud I'd been when I first earned them, how they symbolized belonging. I held them for a long moment, then placed them back in the box, not as something to keep using, but as something finished. I didn't hate those years anymore. They taught me discipline. Skill. Patience. They taught me how systems fail when they rely on one person to silently compensate for everyone else. Most importantly, they taught me that competence without respect becomes exploitation if you let it. My other parent reached out once more, this time with a message that was careful, almost restrained. No accusations. No urgency. Just an acknowledgement that things weren't working the way they'd imagined. I replied politely. Briefly. Kindly. And I didn't reopen the door. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I finally understood that access to my life was not an automatic inheritance. It was something earned through behavior, not history. The sibling I'd once been measured against never reached out directly. Her online presence grew louder, more curated, more insistent. It no longer bothered me. When you stop competing, comparisons lose their power. What surprised me most was how often people around me began to open up. Coworkers shared stories of being overlooked. Friends admitted they were afraid to set boundaries with their own families. Even strangers, once they heard a fragment of my story, would nod in recognition. It turns out a lot of people are quietly carrying weight they were never meant to hold. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I learned that walking away doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally refuse to disappear quietly. Sometimes it's the most honest response to a system that only works if you keep sacrificing yourself. My life now isn't louder or more impressive. It's more aligned. I do work that reflects my abilities. I go home without resentment clinging to my skin. I make plans that don't revolve around preventing someone else's crisis. And when I say yes, it's because I want to, not because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't. If there's one thing I would tell the version of myself who opened that folder, it's this. You weren't wrong to stay. You weren't foolish to hope. But you were never obligated to disappear for the sake of someone else's comfort. Leaving didn't make me less loyal. It made me honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the foundation of every life that actually belongs to you. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.